Elementary, my dear Watson. This man has been dead for at least 2 hours.
Hi there. Welcome to Sherringford Table Talk. This is your podcast for all things considering crime fiction's finest leading men and women. I'm your host, Rusty Baumgartner, and thank you for tuning in to our first episode. In order for you to know what you can expect, I will start by briefly explaining my intentions with this podcast and how I generally plan on working my way through the episodes. But first, let's talk about the name of the podcast. You probably wondered why it is called Sherringford's Table Talk. This has two reasons. Number one is I found the term table talks the perfect equivalent to a podcast if we would move the whole setting back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, when most of our detective stories take place. Secondly, the name Sherringford is an allusion and a small reference to the first given name of the most famous detective of all time. I'm talking, of course, about Sherlock Holmes, the godfather of all detectives. Do you think he would have become as popular as he is today if he would have kept his birth name of Sherringford Hope? Yep. The dynamic duo of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson nearly would have gone under the names of Sherringford Hope and Ormond Sacker. Yes, Watson's birth name is way worse. But luckily for us, the creator Conan Doyle decided to go another path and changed the names to how we know them today. We will, for example, be talking about how this came to be in this episode in just a little while. But as your personal heads up, there are more of facts like these to come. I will not only talk about crime fiction's detectives if they come from books, but also if they appear in TV series or movies, if there is enough material in general to talk about. As you can imagine, there is a second point that we need to discuss before we can start our journey. And this point includes, of course, spoilers. There will be spoilers ahead, but I will do my best to not go into too much details of the stories or cases, so that you can still enjoy them after listening to the episodes. Ideally, I will just broaden your horizon and make you curious enough maybe to read more about these great characters on your own. That being said, from time to time, it will be necessary to dig a little bit deeper into the stories, but only if that means that we can shine more light onto the characters' personalities. I will work through the episodes and go through the characters' fictional biographies as chronologically as possible, just as if you would do when talking about a real person. From time to time, I will throw some curveballs to the creators and authors, but again, only at times when it helps with the detective traits and personalities. Potentially, I will talk about side characters or authors in separate future episodes, because I want to make sure that they get enough attention, but how I will do that will still remain to decide for now. Lastly, I thought about a small common theme to follow through the episodes just so you have some orientation. This common theme will be the archetype of the character at hand. I found this concept of the archetype when I googled the term fictional detective, and in a Wikipedia article were 4 archetypes of fictional detectives listed. Fittingly, someone commented the 4 types with the question of who came up with these, but I will not care. It will not be of importance for us how accurate these 4 archetypes are, because I found them still useful anyhow. These 4 archetypes are amateur detective, private investigator, police detective, and forensic specialist. And at the end of each episode, I or we will be hopefully able to sort our detective into at least one of these types. So, I think that's all for the disclaimer, and we are good to go. Episode 1 of Sherringford's Table Talk, Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is the most famous detective of all time, and there have been numerous depictions of him in all media. In fact, Guinness World Records has listed him as the most portrayed literary human character in film and television history, with more than 75 actors playing the part in over 250 productions. The latest famous ones being Robert Downey Jr. as Sherlock Holmes and Benedict Cumberbatch as the Sherlock in the same named BBC series. The literary source material, written by the late Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, consists of 4 novels and 56 short stories in which Sherlock and his trusty sidekick Dr. John H. Watson have all sorts of great adventures. Today, we will be focusing on the man Sherlock Holmes, but first let's come back to how Conan Doyle decided to name his character. As I said before, it is known that Conan Doyle wanted to initially call his character Sherringford Hope. The name Hope was the name of a whaling ship that was on its way from Scotland to Greenland, and Conan Doyle was on this ship in 1880. There are rumors that Doyle grew bored of studying and decided to flee on this whaling ship. The true reason behind, however, was that Doyle studied medicine, and in those days medical students often served on whale ships in order to practice their future profession. They could take care of the sailors, whose work was very hard and also very dangerous, and they got hurt a lot. So they often had a doctor on board, or in that case, a medical student, probably because they were cheaper. As Doyle returned with the concept of the name Sherringford Hope, he quickly renamed the leading character. That came to be because his first wife found the name Sherringford Hope absolutely awful and persuaded Doyle to rename it. That way, Sherringford Holmes was born, and his last name was a salute to one of Doyle's idols, the American lecturer and reformer Oliver Wendell Holmes. At this point, we nearly came to read the stories about Sherringford Holmes and John Watson. Watson's name, which was first Ormond Sacker, was changed by Doyle in another salute to his first idol's friend Dr. Patrick Watson, but these stories weren't successful and publishers rejected them. Seeing this, Doyle decided to rename his character for the third and final time to Sherlock Holmes. And this finally met success. The name Sherlock could come from Doyle's love for cricket. And he chose it because of his 2 probably favorite cricket players, Mordecai Sherwin and Frank Shacklock. And then he simply decided to combine the 2 names to Sherlock. Another suggestion comes from the Sherlock Holmes Society, who claim that our hero was called after the famous violinist Alfred Sherlock. Well, whatever the case, this way our hero has found his name, and also interestingly, the name Sherlock even had Old English origins. The meanings are bright-haired, short-haired, or sheared, and in the original illustrations, Sherlock Holmes actually always has short black hair. So here is another interesting fact for you. Okay, that's enough with the name talk. Let's come to the character himself. Nothing is really known about Sherlock Holmes' heritage and his past, except for the little hints we receive from his talks with Watson. In the story The Greek Interpreter, for example, Watson speculates about Holmes' skills of observation and deduction, and about the fact that they were the result of hard systematic work. Holmes answers him by telling him that he thinks that about half of it was probably of genetic nature and came from his grandmother, who was the sister of the French artist Vernet. Art in the blood is liable to take the strangest forms, he notes. His other ancestors were country squires, and Holmes goes on to tell Watson about his brother Mycroft then, who, according to him, has an even stronger ability in the skills of reasoning, deduction, and observation. Watson is very interested, and the two spontaneously decide to pay Mycroft a visit at his Diogenes Club, and from that point on the reader is left with no further information on Sherlock's past. Since that's all, I attempted to make my own little deductional assumption on the matter of Holmes' past. It can be reasoned that Holmes' country ancestors lived in Sussex. I based this conclusion on Holmes' return to this county when he finally decided to retire. His retirement house lies at the southern coast of the Downs, as told in the adventure of the Lion Mane. It can therefore be argued that he spent his childhood probably in towns in this area, towns like Eastbourne, Brighton, or in similar places around the coast. In The Last Adventure, which plays in 1914, Holmes was approximately 60 years old, so he must be born sometime around 1854. There is no further information about his school or college years, but I for myself have always seen him studying at Oxford, which is the classic college for brilliant minds when you think about Old England. In The Adventure of the Glorious Scot, Sherlock tells Watson about his experience of the college years. I was never a sociable fellow, Watson, always rather fond of moping in my rooms and working out my own little methods of thought, so that I never mixed much with the men of my year. Bar fencing and boxing aside, I had few athletic tastes, and then my line of study was quite distinct from that of the other fellas, so that we had no points of contact at all. So Holmes, in his own words, was already a very secluded guy, but he managed to make at least one friend, though, who was the young Victor Trevor. The two meet because Trevor's bull terrier decides to bite into Holmes' ankle one day when he went for a walk. A prosaic way to start a friendship, Holmes comments, but Victor Trevor becomes his first real friend and companion, and he even invites Holmes to spend the summer at his father's house in Norfolk. This occasion is very special because there Holmes gets entangled into his first case and into the first opportunity to use his skills as well. There, it also happens that he is hit by the thought of one day maybe using his skills and his nature to make a living for himself. After the adventure of the Glorious Scot, Holmes' university days seem to have changed because he reports, during my last years at the university, there was a good deal of talk there about myself and my methods. So he has started to use his skills and methods more and has that way risen to fame. After college, Holmes moves to the Montague Street in London, which is just around the corner to the British Museum, and there, in his little flat, he starts his profession. He receives his first cases from former colleagues from college. One of these cases is the famous case of the Musgrave ritual, but apart from that, he has a lot of free time and he uses it to learn all the skills he considers necessary for his professional career. Years later, we don't know how many, he goes on to meet Watson in the first novel of Conan Doyle, The Study in Scarlet. In this story, we first get to see Sherlock Holmes through the eyes of Watson. Through Watson's description, we learn something about Holmes' physical appearance. Watson begins with the fact that Holmes is a tall man with over 6 feet in height, who seems even taller because of his exceptionally lean, even thin body. He does not seem fragile, however, but is instead always surrounded by an aura of great mental and physical strength. As the two shake hands, Watson notices that Holmes' hands are surprisingly strong as well, and they show signs of practical work as they're spotted with ink blots and traces of several chemicals. Holmes has all the facial features of the great thinker. He has a high forehead, sharp piercing eyes, a hawk-like nose, and a chin that, according to Watson, shows the man of great determination. Disaccordingly to general beliefs, Holmes is nearly always dressed like a man of his time. That means he wears suits and top hats, and when he strolls through London streets, he uses a walking stick. So he's quite the gentleman of the Victorian era. The famous public image of him in this checkered coat, together with the famous deerstalker, is never explicitly mentioned in the books. The deerstalker is the hat with the two visors, one in the front and one in the rear. Especially this hat probably comes from the time when Watson describes Holmes wearing his ear-flapped traveling cap, which happened in The Adventure of Silver Blaze, or in another occasion he describes him wearing a close-fitting cloth cap in the Boscombe Valley mystery. The first illustrator of Holmes, Sidney Paget, gave the character a deerstalker because it was the most fitting hat to Watson's description, and he himself was used and liked to wear one. So, it is notably important that both Sidney Paget and Holmes would never wear a hat like this while in London or while being in a bigger town. The deerstalker was a hat you would only wear whilst traveling in the country or being in the rural areas, because it is actually, like the name said, a hunting cap. That still fits the stories, because in both the Boscombe Valley mystery and the Adventures of Silver Blaze, Holmes and Watson solve cases in the English countryside. Okay, so Holmes has this demeanor of a charismatic scientist, and he is charismatic because he has the ability, on the one hand, to have a great impact on the people around him. But he doesn't use that all the time, and he also does not seem to care too much about what others think of him, nor does he necessarily seem to need people at all for his personal happiness, as he already told Watson about his college years. Another great example for Holmes not caring about others comes right before Holmes and Watson are introduced to each other for the first time. In The Study in Scarlet, Watson has just returned from the war in Afghanistan. He has been hurt there and was forced to return to London, where he searches for a place to live. His war pension is pretty small, and so he's nearly broke. He decides that he needs to find someone to share some rooms with. Luckily, he meets his former college friend Stamford, who tells him over a drink that a man of the name of Sherlock Holmes also looks for a roommate. Watson is delighted and agrees without hesitation to meet this man. They take a carriage and ride over to the Barts Hospital. During the ride, they talk about Sherlock Holmes, and Watson gains a first impression of his future colleague. Watson logically and understandably assumes that Holmes must be a medical student, because Stamford told him that he is in fact often in the laboratory of the hospital. Stamford, however, denies this and informs the surprised Watson that Holmes just comes to the hospital to beat the dead corpses in the morgue with a stick. He does so, in his own words, in order to find out how far you can produce bruises after death. That must have been quite a shock for the young Watson, and it is fair to say that at this point any normal person would probably get out of the carriage, thank Stamford for his effort, and be on their way. But Watson for the first time shows that he is no ordinary man. Maybe he's very desperate to find a place to live, but he is actually also intrigued even more after this information to meet this Sherlock Holmes. So, here it is interesting that, especially in a time where stand and class were of great importance, Sherlock Holmes always puts his personal science first. He does not care about people wondering about his outwardly weird methods, which includes beating corpses with a stick just to find out something about bruises. As Watson enters the laboratory rooms of the Bard's hospital, Holmes famously greets him with the words, "How are you? You have been to Afghanistan, I perceive." This pragmatism in starting a conversation was Holmes' way to demonstrate the skills of deduction that are so famously associated with his character. Pay attention to the fact that he closes his sentence with "I perceive," as if to tell everyone that this observation is in fact a visual one and that the matter at hand is absolutely obvious, at least to him. He does not go on to explain his observation to Watson and Stamford, though, because he is about to experiment with a solution he personally created that aims at testing if a substance is blood or not, which is quite extraordinary for the time we're talking about. We don't get to hear about the reason behind his research, however, but instead Watson and Holmes go on to talk about their worst habits as roommates. For example, Holmes tells Watson that he likes to be left alone from time to time and that he abruptly starts violin playing when he's in the mood. And Watson, on his part, tells Holmes that he needs silence because his nerves are still very sensitive to noise because of his war experience. Holmes assures him that his violin playing cannot be experienced as noise, and so they agree to move together into the rooms in the Baker Street 221B. There, Holmes goes about his duties, doesn't really tell Watson anything, and Watson, the hurt war veteran, stays at home and observes his new acquaintance in the hope to conclude something about his profession. Holmes has a very unique way of seeing and experiencing the world. And Watson learns about that during one of their eveningly discussions. Watson is stunned to hear that Holmes does not know that the Earth circles around the Sun, nor is he embarrassed about his unknowingness at all. He tells Watson that he does not bother to learn anything that does not directly help him with his work. The good doctor misses this opportunity to ask Holmes about what he actually does, and so he must proceed with creating a list about Holmes' skills and his limits to find out more. This evaluation, as we later find out, is not quite accurate, but it gives us a first glimpse into how Watson at that time experiences Sherlock Holmes. He notes that Holmes knows nothing of literature, philosophy, or astronomy. He also knows pretty much nothing of botany or practical gardening, but seems to know poisons and opiates. Holmes seems to have practical geology knowledge, and he can differentiate soils from each other because he sees their color and their conception, and then he can tell where in London to find them. He is a good chemist. He shows signs of having accurate but unsystematic knowledge of anatomy, and, not surprisingly, he has immense knowledge of sensational literature. In fact, Watson notes, Sherlock Holmes seems to know everything about every horror perpetrated in the century. He plays the violin well, is an expert boxer and swordsman, and has good practical knowledge of the British law. Well, we know what Holmes is doing, but Watson at this point is unable to combine these skills to any profession he knows of, and so he throws the list in the fire. But he's lucky. A few days later, he finds an article on the breakfast table. The article is called The Book of Life and is about the so-called science of deduction. The author tells the reader that a master of the skill is able to distinguish drops of water by their heritage, he can tell a man's profession by his thumb and knees, and his inner thoughts by his clothes and demeanor. Watson openly mocks the writing for its ridiculousness, but is then informed by Sherlock Holmes, who has silently entered the room behind him, that he is in fact the author of the article, and that this deduction is indeed a real skill that he needs to be successful in his profession. Now, finally, Watson asks the man what he does, and we receive the information that Sherlock Holmes is a consulting detective. The first of his kind, as he says, and Watson goes on to wonder if Holmes would have the same abilities as the fictional detectives Auguste Dupin or Monsieur Lecoq. The mentioning of these names is very interesting, because the two are also fictional detectives, and maybe in future episodes I will come to talk about them. But this moment of including two fictional detectives into the story of a fictional detective, treating them as if Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are real and they're just talking about some literary figures, makes this moment probably one of the first meta-fictional ones in crime fiction history. So Holmes, as we can expect, reacts arrogantly, and he's annoyed, and he quickly dismisses the two as amateurs and inferior to him, and thereby he shows actually the knowledge in literature that Watson had so flamboyantly labeled with none before. So this discussion probably would have gotten on for a little while, but Holmes receives a letter from Scotland Yard calling him to a murder scene. He casually on the spot invites Watson to come with him, and Watson hesitantly agrees. And so the way to their first adventure as companions begins. Okay, let's put together the information we have collected so far. Sherlock Holmes is a man ahead of his time. He's the first to use scientific approach to criminology. He's dedicated and disciplined enough to just earn skills that are useful for his profession, and he ignores everything else beside it. He has the genetic nature to concentrate on details for his observations, and then he has developed his own technique through habit and training in deduction to go with it. He is sporty, much more sporty than he seems. He can fight, he's a boxer and swordsman. He's musically talented, which he proves by playing the violin on an expert level. He's a loner most of the time, but he's also able to be friendly, open, and charismatic, as Watson documents in several occasions. In The Sign of Four, for example, he writes, Holmes could talk exceedingly well when he chose, and that night he did choose. He appeared to be in a state of nervous exaltation. I have never known him so brilliant. He spoke on a quick succession of subjects, on miracle plays, on medieval pottery, on Stradivarius violins, on the Buddhism of Ceylon, and on the warships of the future, handling each as though he had made a special study of it. Another of these occasions comes in The Adventure of the Red Circle, as we are informed about Holmes' charismatic, at times even hypnotic powers that he uses here to calm down his client, Mrs. Warren. Watson writes, Holmes leaned forward and laid his long, thin fingers upon the woman's shoulder. He had an almost hypnotic power of soothing when he wished. The scared look faded from her eyes, and her agitated features smoothed into their usual commonplace. She sat down in the chair which he had indicated. So far, so good for Holmes' skills and strengths. But of course, where there is light, there is shadow, and Sherlock Holmes' shadow consists of two kinds, both of different nature. The first haunts him in times of leisure. When Holmes is out of work, he retreats to an alteration between morphine and cocaine, in a 7% solution, as he states. Without excitement, his mind cannot function. At the time when Conan Doyle's stories take place, those drugs were in fact legally available, and even regularly taken by figures like Queen Victoria herself. It was not clear yet at that time that addiction could become dangerous. And Holmes already has this nasty habit at the first time we meet him. Watson writes in The Study in Scarlet, "But now and again a reaction would seize him, and for days on end he would lie upon the sofa in the sitting room, hardly uttering a word or moving a muscle from morning to night. On these occasions I have noticed such a dreamy, vacant expression in his eyes that I might have suspected him of being addicted to the use of some narcotic, had not the temperance and cleanliness of his whole life forbidden such a notion." When Watson's suspicion later becomes reality, the doctor is of course highly against this habit, and he also confronts Holmes often openly on it. Well, maybe it was the inacceptance of his friend, or maybe it was his own personal development, but Holmes assumingly overcomes his addiction in the later years, or at least it is never really heard of it again. His second shadow comes in the form of his arch enemy, Professor James Moriarty, a brilliant mathematician and one of the greatest minds of the century, but also the Napoleon of crime, as Holmes titles him. He is the head of all the big crime of that time, and he, not unlike Holmes, functions primarily in a consulting position, as he plans and intrigues, but he never acts personally. In the story The Final Problem, Holmes and Moriarty clash into each other, and Conan Doyle even initially planned on ending his hero through this confrontation. But the fans intervened, and Holmes lived on to solve around 21 more cases after that. A cool thing with Moriarty here is the opportunity he gives us to play a little thought experiment to estimate Holmes' intelligence. Let's take Dr. Watson, for example, who gets outclassed by Holmes numerous times. He is a doctor of medicine, so that's a very high medical degree. And an IQ, for today's standards for a doctor of medicine, can be estimated to be around 130. Moriarty, on the other hand, is a professor of mathematics, and he's one of the most brilliant minds of the century. So if you would compare this to brilliant scientists and developers of our today's world, Moriarty's IQ maybe move around 170 to 190. And now we have Sherlock Holmes, who even managed to outthink and outsmart Moriarty. So his IQ is even above that. It is fair to say that his IQ can be estimated around 190 or even 200. Well, that's something, isn't it? Okay, so lastly, we have one open topic to discuss, and that is Holmes' extraordinary relation to women. In The Sign of Four, Holmes states, "But love is an emotional thing, and whatever is emotional is opposed to that true cold reason which I place above all things. I should never marry myself, lest I bias my judgment." So Holmes has this unique attitude to women, and it might relate to something in his childhood, of which we know so little about, but overall it can be said that he doesn't hate women. In most of the stories, Holmes acts upon the women that surround him with charm and respect, but there's also this slight arrogance. For example, in The Master Blackmailer, Holmes disguises himself as a plumber and thereby gains the heart of a maid of service to attain necessary information. As he gets what he wants, he leaves her and lets a free path behind for his romantic rival, as he says. This in the books is the only time that Holmes acts upon a woman in an unchivalrous manner. Then we have the other woman, the only woman. It is the only woman Holmes actually respects, the great Irene Adler. But it is just respect. There are no romantic feelings involved. Holmes is rather fascinated because she is the only woman who managed to outsmart the master detective in the adventure A Scandal in Bohemia. Sherlock Holmes honors her for this by putting her photograph on the mantelpiece. So, we are moving towards the end here. How can we round up the story of this brilliant detective? Well, as we know, Holmes retreats to his little house in Sussex, where he, quote, gives himself to the enjoying life in nature for which he had so often yearned during the long years spent amid the gloom of London. The reason for his retirement is not quite clear, because his skills seem to be the same, and he proves that in the story The Lion's Mane, where he already lives in his little dream house. But maybe that just seems this way to us readers, and he himself felt differently. For example, in the story The Crooked Man, Holmes is infuriated about the fact that he has overseen a detail of importance until the very end of the case. And he says about it, "Oh, Watson, Watson, what a fool I have been. It seems incredible, and yet it must be true. All points in one direction. How could I miss seeing the connection of ideas? Those knuckles, how could I have passed those knuckles? And the dog, and the ivy. It's surely time that I disappeared into that little farm of my dreams." And, before the year was over, Holmes has done so. He had left London, and we find him next in Sussex. There he concentrates all his attention on beekeeping, and he also writes a book about it with the title Practical Handbook of Bee Culture with Some Observations upon the Segregation of the Queen. Holmes comments this magnum opus with, "Alone I did it. Behold the fruit of pensive nights and laborious days, when I watched the little working gangs as once I watched the criminal world of London." At this time, Sherlock Holmes' friendship with Watson has shrunken to occasional weekend visits, and Sherlock Holmes even writes his last cases by himself. Only once do we see the duo united again in the story His Last Bow. There they chat a last time about the past, until Holmes predicts the coming of an east wind. It is possibly his way of predicting the First World War. He says, "Such a wind has never blew on England yet. It will be cold and bitter, Watson, and a good many of us may wither before its blast." So, before I close, let's put our master detective into his archetype. I think it is fair to say that Holmes belongs into 3 of the 4 types. He is an amateur detective, but he's also a private investigator, and he's definitely a forensic specialist. But I think we will never bring him to be a police detective, though. But for all the other types, I think he more than fills all the shoes. Normally, I would elaborate a little bit more on my decision about which of the archetypes fits our detective best. But I've really exceedingly talked here about all of Holmes' different skills and his abilities. So it feels that I would just repeat myself too much at this point. I will definitely do it for the other detectives, but for him, I think it's good like that. I think with all the stuff we've discussed so far, most of you would agree with my decision. Coming back to the wind that Holmes predicts, I do not think that neither him nor Watson have withered under its blow, as he says, so I can happily leave you with Sherlock Holmes' very own comment on his illustrious life. I think that I may go so far as to say, Watson, that I have not lived wholly in vain. If my record were closed tonight, I could still survey it with equanimity. The air of London is the sweeter for my presence, And in over 1,000 cases, I'm not aware that I have ever used my powers upon the wrong side.